Hello, and welcome to Facts Lunch and Learn on Abuse Against People with Disabilities. I'm Nicole Poulin, and I serve as Executive Director for the Family and Children's Trust, or FACT, of Virginia. We were created by the General Assembly in 1986 as a public-private partnership to raise funds, increase awareness, and advise on policies for the prevention of family violence across the lifespan. That includes child abuse and neglect, domestic violence, sexual assault, and abuse against older adults. As part of that work, FACT creates and distributes issue briefs on topics related to family violence. Our new series is focused on abuse and neglect of special populations. The first in that series is on the topic of today's Lunch and Learn. It's on abuse against people with disabilities. So with that, I'd like to introduce our speaker today, Molly Dellinger-Ray, who is a project director with the Partnership for People with Disabilities. And we are really happy and honored to have you here today, Molly.
Thank you so much. I'm so happy to be here. I hope everyone can see the screen. And I want to, before we go any further, want to thank Taylor Holy and FACT for bringing attention to this really important issue. This is something that the Partnership for People with Disabilities at VCU has been working on since the year 2000. So it's now 2023, almost 2024. So we've spent many years kind of crying into the darkness about the issue of abuse and neglect of children and adults with disabilities. And I'm just really happy that someone is hearing us. I really appreciate that. The Partnership for People with Disabilities is a University Center for Excellence in Developmental Disabilities. And every state, or like 46 states, have a University Center for Excellence. And in Virginia, it's VCU. I am a project director of one of the projects I direct there is called LEAP. It stands for Leadership for Empowerment and Abuse Prevention. And we did a lot of work collaborating with a lot of different agencies to begin to teach people with intellectual disabilities about some abuse prevention strategies. And so a lot of what I'm talking about, I've learned in my role as the LEAP project director. I'm also the parent of a child who was diagnosed with a disability way back in the early 1990s. And I am a certified trainer in something called person-centered thinking training and stewards of children, which also just sort of helped contribute to how I learned everything that I learned about this. Let's see here, trying to advance my slide. There we go, wrong way. Everybody sees the world differently. If this is something that makes you uncomfortable for any reason and you still want the information, you're welcome to leave the webinar, leave the recording, and get in touch with me or Nicole privately. We'd be happy to chat with you about it. But everyone's perspective is a little different depending on what your role is as a parent, as a professional, as a general citizen who cares in the world. So sorry, someday I'm going to learn to operate this. So we're going to talk a little bit about people with disabilities and what abuse looks like. We'll spend a lot of time talking about why people with disabilities experience such high rates of violence. And then we'll talk about some prevention strategies. So just going to start with, what is a disability? You can have a physical disability, like someone who uses a wheelchair or has a mobility disability. You can have an intellectual disability, which is a cognitive disability, which means you are cognitively impaired. You don't process things the way the typical brains process things. We know a lot of people who are on the autism spectrum, and people with autism may be co-occurring with other disabilities. Any of these disabilities can co-occur. And then hidden disabilities. You know, oftentimes there are disabilities that you cannot see or would not know that someone has, like a traumatic brain injury, that you just wouldn't know is there by looking at them. So when we're talking about disabilities, we're talking about this very wide range of disabilities. And as I said, you can have a co-occurrence of 2 or more of these disabilities, like somebody who may have Down syndrome and autism. Loved this. This is taken straight out of the issue brief. This is Virginia's population of disabled people from 2021. So I just used that in the PowerPoint, but you can check that out more thoroughly in the issue brief. But I also want to talk about the kinds of abuse that people experience. So like physical abuse, people are usually very familiar with that. Things like hitting someone or kicking someone, pushing them, threatening to use a weapon, or preventing someone from leaving. Or emotional abuse, calling someone degrading names, threatening to harm them, torturing pets, destroying property, controlling, preventing someone from seeing their friends or their family, or maybe using a vehicle or escaping, sexual abuse, financial abuse. Somebody might discourage or forbid someone from working or withhold finances. I know the next issue, if I'm going to be really curious to see, is about institutional abuse, where people basically surrender everything to the place where they live, and can easily be financially exploited. And then neglect, which is failing to provide care or medical treatment that results in injury or damages your safety. However, many times these kinds of abuses in someone's life can cause a disability. And so I think that's something that we often don't think about when we think about abuse of people with disabilities, is that oftentimes the disability is the reason for the abuse. So for people with disabilities, abuse sometimes looks a little bit different. There are things that are very hard to observe or even know that are happening. Things like withholding or disabling assistive devices, things that help people communicate, for example, or disabling adaptive equipment like wheelchairs, hiding or mismanaging medications, neglect, refusing to move someone or to allow them to move, keeping them from a vehicle, or disabling communication devices. This doesn't include things like gaslighting, minimizing, and invalidating some of the beliefs that people with disabilities will express. And this is straight from the issue brief also. People with disabilities are 7 times as likely to experience sexual assault compared to their peers, and disabled women are 12 times more likely to experience sexual assault compared to non-disabled women. When you look specifically at people with intellectual disabilities, and that is the population for whom we designed the abuse prevention project that I work on called LEAP, the statistics are equally as startling. I'm not going to go through each one of them, but it's prevalent in children as well as adults. And the same with sexual assault, very startling statistics for sexual assault. The one thing that I noticed is that the high statistic at the end, that 49% of people who experience sexual violence will experience 10 or more incidences. That was a very startling statistics for me. Autism is something that we're just beginning to take notice of. And so here is some information on sexual violence and sexual assault against autistic youth. And mind you, all of these statistics are only from reported incidences. Okay, so if an incident goes unreported, and we know there's a lot of unreported incidences, that won't be counted in these data. So, and the other thing that we know is that crimes are committed by someone that the victim knows well. There was a recent story in September of this year of a 25-year-old guy in Stafford who assaulted 3 girls on a high school basketball team and 3 girls on a high school basketball team that he was an assistant coach or something for. But his regular job was as an aide in a special education classroom. And that was a really sobering moment for me to read that. So just to summarize again really quickly, people with disabilities experience all kinds of abuse over longer periods of time by multiple perpetrators. And I went quickly through these statistics, and they are grim and startling. But I want people to remember that, every statistic is a person behind it. And I have a story that I always tell when I talk about this. It's something, as I mentioned before, I'm a parent of a child who was diagnosed with a disability, and I've learned so much in teaching LEAP when I go around to teach people. And I met this young woman who I'm calling Bethany in a LEAP class. And she was a really engaged young woman, and she's probably in her 30s, and she was very cute. She always, she had a sense of style. She had like matching socks and matching hair tie, and was very pulled together. And she also was very engaged in the class. So if you're teaching a class and there's somebody who's making eye contact and they're nodding their heads, that's somebody who you really feel like you're connecting with. She lived in an apartment, and she got drop-in assistance from staff in the apartments. It was a supervised residential facility that had individual apartments. And during the day, she worked as a hotel housekeeper. So on paper, she was doing pretty well for someone with an intellectual disability. She also had a physical disability. In the second session of this training, we talk about all the different ways that people can say no and finding the way that works best for you, because everyone has a different way to say no. And if you practice that, then when you actually need to pull that out, you have it rehearsed and it's a little bit easier. And during that, Bethany put this note on the parking lot. Was a little place where you can talk about things later. I have a problem with saying no to someone touching me because I'm afraid he's going to hurt me. And I followed up with her, and she said, well, it's my boyfriend. I have a problem saying no to him because I'm afraid he's going to hurt me. And I said, let's talk about this a little bit more after the class. And she, kind of minimized it and said, no, I need to get on the bus and it's really nothing. And, that's very, very typical. She made this gentle disclosure and then kind of backed off of it. And I followed up the very next morning. I called the executive director of the agency saying, hey, there's something going on with Bethany and her boyfriend. Could you look into it? I don't know her. I've met her twice. Could somebody who's close to her find out? And it turned out that the person she was calling her boyfriend was a staff person. And he lived in the apartment complex. He liked it so much that he moved his wife and his young son to the same apartment complex. And when the executive director kind of started interviewing people and talking to people, they discovered that he had non-consensual sex with Bethany and 2 other women and 1 guy. So he was a serial sexual predator who had unlimited access to multiple people to whom he could dominate. And he was living right there. So every one of these statistics has a person like Bethany on the other end of it. I want people to keep that in mind as we're talking about it. We're going to talk about why people with disabilities experience such high rates of abuse. But I want to touch first upon caregiver stress. And when we talk to people about abuse of people with disabilities, they say, oh, it's because their care providers are under so much stress. And what I always say to people is, how many people are parents? Lots of people who are parents have experienced stress. I don't think I know one single parent of a child who's gifted, who's not experienced stress at some point. And I think often parents of kids with disabilities do experience stress. They do experience more stress, and they experience stress over a longer period of time. But that is not really a contributor when we look at the dynamics of abuse. That is not the reason that people with disabilities experience higher rates of abuse. So we're going to talk about why that happens now. How many people do we have with this? Is there any way for people to participate in the audience, or should I just go through this?
I think it's probably best just to go through it.
Okie doke.
Unless,
So
I'm sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off. Mary Beth, we have one live audience member, so I certainly don't want to dissuade her from participating. I also just didn't want to put her on the spot.
we don't want to put you in the hot seat, Mary Beth, so I'll move along.
I'm happy to be on the hot seat, whatever works best for you.
So what are some reasons that you think people with disabilities experience such high rates of abuse?
Well, personally, I work at DBHDS, but I also have a brother with cerebral palsy, and he is, anyway, he has experienced abuse and exploitation. So I think for him, he's very trusting. He really wants friends. Like, he is very open to that, and I think maybe that's related to being trusting. And he's a little naive about how the world works and what bad things could happen. So those are just some things for him.
Thank you for that. I'm sorry to hear this about your brother, and thank you for working to DBHDS. They support LEAP, and we're very grateful to them and several other projects that I worked on. So we are good friends with DBHDS and really appreciate the work that they do. So one of the reasons, and especially people with physical disabilities, that they may experience abuse are skewed boundaries. So if you are a person who has a need for assistance with the activities of daily living, like helping somebody get dressed or helping someone take a bath, that increases an opportunity for abusive or intrusive touch or touch that crosses a boundary. It's sometimes really difficult to discriminate an assistive touch from an illegal touch, or to note if a touch was intentional or if it, seemed to be an accident. Also, probably, Mary Beth, like your brother, people weren't taught to protect themselves, and that leads to lack of assertiveness and personal boundaries. And many people are just really touch tolerant. They're just used to having been touched for their whole lives. By people who help provide care for them. And I will say, in my experience, I think that people with disabilities are touched in different ways than the general population, for generally good intentions. But I will find that oftentimes when I meet someone with a disability, the first thing they'll do is go to hug me. And I'm not a person who hates being hugged, but generally I don't hug someone the first time I've met them, particularly if it's in a professional setting. And oftentimes people intend touch to be very comforting, which it is, although sometimes people with disabilities are not asking for that touch. The other thing that I should note is that equipment, touching someone's equipment, someone's wheelchair or someone's assistive device, is like touching their body. And oftentimes the non-disabled people don't realize that it's very intrusive to touch someone's adaptive equipment. It's like touching their body. So having those touch boundaries and that touch tolerance is one reason that just makes things sort of very confusing for people. Beverly Franz, who works out of the Pennsylvania Coalition Against Rape, has been working on this problem for a long, long time, and it's one of the first person I heard talk about it. And one of the things that she always said is the best victim is one who won't tell. And people are unable to tell or seek help for a variety of reasons, just as the non-disabled population is. And Nicole and I have talked about this many times. The dynamics for people with disabilities are very similar to the non-disabled population. They're unable to tell someone. They may be physically unable to tell someone. They may not be able to talk or be able to communicate that. But one of the other things that we've learned in doing the LEAP intervention that we have done, one of the things, LEAP is an evidence-based program, and one of the things that we noticed in our post-test and in our 3-month follow-up test is that participating in the LEAP training helped increase people's vocabulary of being able to describe why a relationship is unhealthy. And so oftentimes people literally don't know the words to describe what happened to them and don't have the vocabulary to describe why it just didn't feel right. The person may not be believed, and we'll talk about that when we in a little minute, and other reasons. Another reason you touched on, Mary Beth, is that people can be isolated, and it's hard for people to get out and to stay connected. And so one person who exhibits just the smallest bit of kindness becomes a much more important person in the life of someone who may be lonely and isolated. Also, people with social skills deficits can be very, very lonely. And that makes them very vulnerable to untrusting relationships, unhealthy relationships. So they're easy targets for perpetrators of abuse. One thing that was mentioned in the issue brief that I really appreciated was financial insecurity. And on top of that, I sort of think it's not just financial insecurity, there's insecurity on so many levels. So financial abuse is one of the main reasons that survivors stay in abusive relationship, is financial insecurity. But for someone who needs a support provider, they may literally have no one to help them, like get out of bed in the morning, if they cease a relationship with a care provider. So they're really, really dependent upon people who may not be healthy for them to be around. And right now, we are in a staffing crisis. There is a dearth of care providers that provide care for people with disabilities. And there's lots of ways that we are working to combat this. But it also is a way that enables people to become a little bit more vulnerable. Just as people without disabilities experiencing abuse, power and control is a big issue. And paid staff providers are in a natural position of leadership, which can sometimes turn into a real unhealthy dominance. When someone is always providing support, that it can easily shift in those ways. And that ties in with me with trained compliance. And so I always like to think about, I work in helping people with challenging behaviors with positive behavior support. And I used to do a lot of work in schools and talking to special education teachers. And I used to always say, what is it that you want this child to do? And they'd say, like, I just want her to do what I tell her to do when I tell her to do it. And I always think, like, how many people live with someone who you would just live with another non-disabled adult who you would love to just have them do whatever you say, whenever you say to do it. People are rewarded for doing as they're told, and they get into trouble for being non-compliant. And what I always say is we need to teach people to respectfully object, and to be able to assert their own rights. The other thing that is a sad but true fact is that perpetrators gain access to people through disability services. I have worked in the field of disabilities really since before college, doing volunteer work and things like that. And most of the people who I work with are wonderful and good-hearted people. But if you are a perpetrator who has power and control issues, this is a very soft target population. I mentioned earlier that I'm a parent of a child who was diagnosed with a disability when he was 3. And I just noticed in my own life that my relationship and the number of professionals who are involved in my son's life compared to my non-disabled daughter's life was vastly different. First of all, he had a number of more professionals, a huge number of more professionals in his life. Instead of a preschool teacher and a preschool aide, which he also had a preschool inclusion special education teacher, a preschool inclusion aide, a speech therapist, an occupational therapist. He didn't have physical therapy. He did not need that, although many children do. And so if you think about just the number of professionals in his life compared to my non-disabled daughter, it's much higher. But the thing that I think is more startling and sort of opens another crack in the armor is that even as a parent who had a master's degree in special education, when my child was diagnosed with a disability, everyone is so desperate to get the care that they need for their child and to make sure that they're getting the absolute very best. That your relationships with those professionals is very, very different. And they came to my house many times. They sent my son, I always say on his 21st birthday, he got a birthday card from the woman who was his preschool inclusion teacher. And I'm so delighted that we had a wonderful relationship with her, but I can't tell you the name of my other child's preschool teacher. So the boundaries are just much fuzzier for families with professionals when they have a child with a disability. And so it's very easy to be able to have that kind of crack in the shield for a family to get in there. This is just a quote from a young boy, is that people with disabilities are frequently not believed. So we spent a lot of time, and I learned a lot about doing this through the LEAP intervention and it's so hard and it's so vague of describing what is a friend, okay? So are your Facebook friends really your friends? Some may be, some may not be. Are the kids that you went to school with 20 years ago your friends? You shared a classroom with them, but are they a friend because you happen to be born at the same year in the same neighborhood? And then friends with benefits, which is a term people use, which is also kind of makes things a little bit more confusing. So I feel like the term friend is used very, very casually. And because you're a friend with somebody at one point in your life, does that mean they're your friend forever? So those kinds of nuanced relationships can be really hard for people to navigate if you're a person with very concrete understanding. We had many, many conversations about how to teach people the difference between someone who's your friend and someone who is paid to support you. And so we decided we'd make a T-chart to just, explain what the difference is. And really, there aren't no big differences. Someone who is your friend listens to you and helps you problem solve. Well, so does your paid supporter. Your friends help celebrate your successes. When you're successful at something, so does a paid supporter. If you need help, you can go ask a paid supporter, just as you would ask a friend. And somebody who advocates for you to have a better quality of life. There are many, many just such hardworking and dedicated professionals. And so it's very hard to discriminate between what is a friend and what is a paid supporter. And when I talk to direct support providers of people with disabilities, and I say, you know, do you love your job so much? Yes, I love it. I want to do this. I'm going to do this until I retire. And I say, if another agency came along that offered you more money to do the same thing, would you leave? Well, maybe I would. And so the lines are fuzzy on both sides, I would say. And that makes it really, really difficult. I want to talk about some of the cultural myths and attitudes about people with disabilities and what they can do. The assumptions that people with disabilities are wild and promiscuous. Many people have not been taught some basic information about appropriate sexual behavior, and so they get a reputation for being wild and promiscuous. Or the opposite, that they're innocent and asexual and that they're not interested in romance or sexuality, that they're incompetent or stupid, that they don't feel or they can't understand, that they are without opinions or boundaries, that they're pitied or put on a pedestal. I still hear that people with disabilities are being punished by God, or that disabilities are contagious. People are not interested in being around people with disabilities, being close to them and having close relationships with them. And all of those misbeliefs lead to behaviors. And those behaviors are social distancing, devaluation of people with disabilities, and blaming the victim. And so oftentimes this is another reason why people with disabilities experience high rates of abuse. I know from my own experience, and I'm going to have to use Nicole and Taylor as an example. They're both on the call with me right now, and they work together. When I was a special education teacher, and I told people I worked with people with disabilities, or even now I say I support people with disabilities in my job, the first thing that people say when I say that is, you must be so patient. You must be a saint. You are a superhero. I couldn't do that. I couldn't do what you do. And so if I were to say to Taylor, for example, Taylor, you must be a saint to work with Nicole. You were a superhero to work with Nicole. I couldn't do that. I don't have the patience. There's a special place in heaven for you, Taylor. Then I'd say, you know, who wants to work with Nicole? Okay. So even though those comments are very well-meaning, they're really not respectful to people with disabilities. It's really very discriminating against someone, and it's hurtful to people with disabilities to say those things. So this is a little transition. This was Sam, who told a story about a staff member who sexually assaulted him in the basement. As I said, every one of these statistics and these stories, there's a real person behind it. So I want to move on now and talk about some of the things that we can do to prevent abuse from happening. I always like to show these guiding principles that people with disabilities, as all of us, need to be protected from being victims, to be treated fairly and with dignity, to live up to their full potential, and to get the support from others to be treated justly. So those are the guiding principles that we use in moving forward. What we teach when we teach LEAP, which stands again for Leadership for Empowerment and Abuse Prevention, is we start by doing a relationship map. And we ask people to really figure out the boundaries of where people belong in their world, and to think about how they feel about those people, how much they trust them, what kinds of information could they share with them, what kind of touch is appropriate, and how much trust is there with the people. So we go through each of these layers in these relationship map, and notice that it's a spiral. Nobody relationships are not static. People may become close, very, very close to you when you're working on a specific project or you live in a specific place, and then things change. And so people are always moving in and out of these spaces. So people have an opportunity to become better friends, or some people to whom we're very, very close to may move away and become less important in our lives. We have a special place for people with whom you're in romantic relationships. And we also believe in the red circle. And the red circle is for people who you just do not want in your life right now. And we all have the ability to decide that there's a relationship in our life that just isn't healthy. And we deserve the right to be able to end those relationships, or at least stop trusting that person. And what I always say to people is, you can put someone in the red circle, you don't even have to tell them that they're there, but you know in your heart that that's not a person that you can trust. When we do it on their relationship maps, the red circle has a dotted line around it, so you can always get out of the red circle at some point. But that should be everyone's right, to end a relationship that's unhealthy. And sometimes we just don't see that. I always think about the words that we use when we describe people with disabilities. And this is really something that we teach in person-centered thinking training a lot, is when we describe someone with a disability, typically the disability is what is described first. And so I like to flip that around by talking about what you like and admire about the person before they're told about the disability. So this is a person who's funny, who's a hard worker, who tells great jokes, who has really close family relationships and close friends, who loves to have a party, and he has cerebral palsy. Okay, so thinking about what you like and admire about the person before you describe them with their disability, I think is really, really important. Mentioning those characteristics first, as opposed to, he's a wheelchair person, he's autistic, he's got Down syndrome, she's got Down syndrome. So I think those are just really important to keep in mind about mentioning those positive characteristics. And I always think I wouldn't like to be described by my disabilities in ways that I'm different from typically developing people. And I don't think it's fair to do it for people with disabilities either. I have a short video here, and it is just 1 minute long, so I'm going to hit the play button. But it's about when you are meeting and talking to someone with a disability, and I'm going to hit the play button and let Jo Beth explain it much better than I could.
I don't like when I go to a new place, someone new who doesn't know me, talk to someone who with me. I understand me. For example, I went to a new doctor and they talked to my mom instead of me. They asked her the questions like, how old was her birthday? How tall is she? Why are we here to see her today? When I am capable as an independent adult to answer these questions about myself.
I love that little video clip. And I actually have a sticker that says presume competence. So I think it's important that we presume competence. Another thing that I learned in doing this abuse prevention, we had a multidisciplinary team, including people with disabilities and their family members, when we were figuring out the curriculum. And it was really, really important to them that we include the correct names for body parts. That many adults with disabilities have never been taught the correct names for their body parts. And therefore, if they were to disclose abuse, they might not know how to say it, or to say it in a way that anyone else would understand it. Also, oftentimes, while they're in school, kids with disabilities are not included in family life education. And therefore, they miss out on a lot of really important information about consent and about touch boundaries, because they're not included in those classes. So it's important that people with disabilities know those correct names for those body parts. And I mentioned earlier, just respecting those touch boundaries. When meeting someone with a disability or talking to them, of asking permission before you touch them or you touch their equipment. If someone with a disability, for example, needs help, and you're there to say, hey, let me help you. I'm going to touch your arm now and help lead you through this passageway. I always do that for a woman who I work with who's blind, of saying, I'm going to put my hand right here. I'm going to take a walk here, and I pretty much narrate every single thing that's coming, like there's a step coming or whatever. But just the touch boundary, and just making that verbal statement of asking permission to touch someone. Lastly, what we teach people is that there is one person that you can talk to, that you can share things with, that you can have a conversation with if you are in a relationship that might be uncomfortable or unhealthy. And then also, if someone, I always think, I show these stepping stones because oftentimes people sort of drop little hints, sort of like passing that note to me during that LEAP training, of someone, sort of laying out the stepping stones and sort of seeing if you're going to follow up with that. I think it's really important, knowing what we know about this population of people, is that if you have a hint that something isn't right, it's really important to follow through with it. So Nicole, what questions do you have?
So I wonder, Molly, if you could maybe share a little bit more information about LEAP and kind of how unique it is.
I could talk about LEAP all day, so I'll try to behave myself. LEAP is a 4-session abuse prevention program that was designed for adults with intellectual disabilities. It is taught by a person with a disability and a co-trainer. So there's a person with a disability who administers the training. It's in 4 sessions that are highly interactive. They're 90 minutes long. The trainers for LEAP are terrific. They're very, very engaged. The non-disabled trainers as well as the disabled trainers are extremely invested in getting the program going. And most of the people who are LEAP trainers with disabilities have disclosed to me that they have experienced abuse in the past. And so this is something that's very important to them. And it's not always by a staff person or an adult when they were little. Sometimes it's another person with a disability that's been the perpetrator of abuse. And what we learned when we did LEAP is that so many people disclosed abuse in those LEAP training sessions that we really spent a long time training our trainers on what to do if someone discloses abuse. They are not trained sexual violence counselors. And we have them referring out and knowing information about who to call. But they oftentimes, people do disclose. When you start having these conversations with people, you end up finding things out. And sometimes they're things that happened a long time ago, and sometimes they're things that are current.
And what would you say is kind of the most surprising thing you feel like you learned in doing LEAP?
Oh, there's so many surprises. But to me, one of the hardest things, and it still remains a hard thing, is, are paid staff members your friends? That is a really hard concept for people. Many times when we did the pre and post test with LEAP, and we'd ask people about, are staff always your friends? Yes, they are. They're the best friends you could ever have. And that was a really hard concept for some people, and still is. Another thing that was surprising and hard for me, and we noticed this a lot in the pre-test, and thankfully it improved in the post-test, was there's a lot of victim blaming. We showed people scenarios, if somebody breaks a rule, or if somebody, behaves poorly and experiences abuse, they're likely to say, like, oh, well, she shouldn't have ridden in the front seat of the van. That's what you get. And instead of saying, no, she broke a rule, but she didn't deserve to be sexually assaulted. So those were pretty surprising.
And our audience member, Mary Beth, would you like to jump in with your question?
Sure. So my question is, how do you deliver the training? How do you find your audience of people to take the training?
We, at the Partnership for People with Disabilities, we are pretty well known in the disability community. Although we're located at VCU, we do a lot of community outreach. We have had a lot of success with day support programs, because they have sort of a captive audience of people with whom they need to find stuff to do every day. Sometimes it's hard. There are some day support programs where the people are so busy that they'd have to say, like, do you want to go on the golf outing, or do you want to play, have LEAP training? So we have to have them kind of not schedule competing activities for when LEAP training occurs. But we are always looking for places that might be interested in having a LEAP training. It is free to the organizations. And we're currently coordinating with FACT to have some agencies become certified centers for abuse prevention and safety. There is one that currently exists right now that's in Henrico County, where they have a LEAP staff person, or two trainers who are staff members there. One's a participant. She's a young woman with an intellectual disability, and another is a staff person who are in-house. And so they can provide the training whenever they want to. And they also have set up, sort of an unofficial go-to person. If someone is in an unhealthy relationships, they have those people identified as someone who they can talk to and share information with if it's needed. So that's a really good model. Does that answer your question?
It does, and it brings up more questions, if that's okay.
Sure.
What type of provider is that has an in-house trainer? I'm curious.
It's a sheltered workshop. It's Hermitage Enterprise.
Okay.
And
Interesting.
they have a really dedicated staff person, and she became a LEAP trainer. And then they have a young woman who uses services from Hermitage Enterprises, who's her co-trainer. And they have a LEAP kit, and whenever they want to, they can set up a training, or I can always set up trainings elsewhere and get staff members to come, or I do the training and pick up a staff person. I love to do the training. We do have other LEAP trainers who are non-disabled besides me. But if there's an opportunity to do it, I usually try to do it if I can.
So I wonder, I work at DVHDS and we have our Office of Human Rights, and they are responsible for investigating, mitigating abuse, neglect, and exploitation for individuals receiving services through DVHDS. I wonder, do y'all have a partnership with them? Do they promote the LEAP training? I feel like I should know this, but I don't.
We are, well, our closest relationship is with the IFSP group.
Okay.
So the individual and family supports, they are the ones who fund LEAP and promote LEAP. We also provide webinars, usually 4 a year, 3 or 4 a year, to direct support providers on ways to foster healthy relationships and prevent abuse from happening by learning things like what's in this webinar. And those have become very popular. I think the last one we had about 90 participants, and they participate in the training and then take a quiz and get a certificate.
Okay, very cool. I mean, I don't know if it's helpful to you. I know that the Office of Human Rights just hired a new training coordinator, and I think this would be helpful information just for them to know about and maybe promote in their networks.
I would love that. If you want to shoot me an email and copy that person on it, it would be great. They should know about LEAP, but we know DBHDS is a huge agency, as is VCU. And oftentimes it's a left hand, right hand kind of thing.
Yeah, right. Exactly.
And Molly, I always think it's worth noting that, Virginia is really lucky in that we have LEAP because there are not a lot of evidence-based trainings focused on this topic. Isn't that correct?
Yeah, you are absolutely right. There are very few there are some evidence informed, but there are very few evidence based. VCU is not easy to get through their research protocols. So we had, very strict protocols to evaluating LEAP to determine if people really remembered and learned something from the concepts. And I was very pleased that we did a pre and post test, but we also did a post test 3 months after the training, and people still remembered the concepts. So one thing with people with disabilities is that, one shot usually does not do it. People need to hear the concepts over and over again. So we say just because you've taken LEAP once, you should take it again. I think people should take it every year, frankly. It's just a healthy booster shot. And we kind of upgrade it. And I talk to our trainers a lot about things that might be better explained in other ways or ways to make the training go more smoothly. And so we're constantly tweaking it and making it a little bit better for people. We started LEAP in 2013. And so when we started LEAP, internet relationships were not a big thing. The focus group that we did with LEAP, most of them did not have cell phones. So that's changed a lot. Okay, so now we had to adjust it to include online relationships. And what I always say about LEAP is that it's really important that people recognize that it is not dating, it's not social skills training, it's not sex education, it's healthy relationships. And your relationship can be healthy, whether it's with an online friend or your next door neighbor. And so that is what we stay in our lane of healthy relationships. That's our focus.
And just one last question, I think, for folks with regard to some of these day support services and other types of services. If you are a parent of a child with disabilities, are there any kind of specific policies or protocols, organizational policies or protocols that might be helpful for parents to kind of be mindful of or interested in learning about prior to accessing them or while their child is accessing them that you think can help be kind of a protective factor?
Well, I think, the more transparent an agency is, the better off, literally transparent, that you can see what's going on and that there aren't large periods of time where one person is alone with another person, is certainly something I would be aware of. And I cringe when I think about the number of tutors and specialists that I would drop my son off at the door and they'd close the door and I'd say, okay, I'll see you in an hour. Um, and now I think, it might have been a good idea to have popped back in or to say like, hey, I got here a little bit early. I just wanted to see how things are going. Those kinds of things of having that transparency, and that ability to feel like you can pop in sometime. And I always say to people like, just, not asking, did anyone hurt you? Sometimes a sexual touch does not hurt. It feels really good sometimes. And so really saying, is there anything happened that made you uncomfortable? Or is there any reason you don't want to do this again? Did everything go okay? Just knowing that there's a safe place for someone to have those conversations.
That's great. And I think that that's really consistent with kind of what we tell all parents on this topic. And I'm always, as you mentioned, I'm always struck by how, the perpetrating behavior is kind of the same. What varies is the populations that's being targeted just has different vulnerabilities. So the dynamics are consistent as far as power and control and keeping things secret and being manipulative and grooming techniques. It's just that kind of the variables associated with how that's done changes depending on kind of the population being targeted. And this is a population that we know has not gotten a lot of recognition at all with regard to this topic and so many things. So we just really want to thank you and all the work from the partnership around this topic and everything you do in this world on this for this population. And thank you so much for taking time today to participate in this and for being on the editorial and planning committee to contribute to our issue brief. Just thank you, Molly.
Thank you, because and to you and Taylor, because that issue brief really encapsulates so much great information in a very short amount of pages and words. So thank you so much for that. That is a fabulous job.
And we would encourage everybody watching this to look on our website to learn more about FACT's work and the partnership's work. And certainly feel free to reach out to any of us with any questions that you may have. So with that, I think we're going to wrap it up unless there's anything else. And thank everyone for their time and interest on this.
Absolutely.